The bread was still warm when Elira Voss slipped it beneath her shawl, and the warmth of it frightened her more than the theft itself. She had told herself, walking into the market that morning, that she would only look, only smell the yeast rising from the baker's stall, only imagine for a moment what it might be like to eat until her stomach stopped aching. But then she had seen her brother's face in her mind. 6 years old, his cheeks hollowed by a winter that would not end, his small hands trembling as he tried to warm them over a fire that had gone out 3 days ago because there was no coal left to burn, and her hand had moved before her conscience could stop it. Now she was running. The cobblestones of Ashcombe were slick with the morning's frost, and Elira's worn boots, patched at the toes with strips of old cloth, found no purchase as she wove between market stalls and startled geese. Behind her, the baker's wife had begun to shout, "Thief! Thief! Someone stop her!" And the word chased her down the narrow lane like a hound let off its leash. She did not look back. Looking back had cost girls their hands before, in Ashcombe. She had seen the iron manacles bolted to the post in the town square, had heard the stories whispered by the older women at the well. A loaf of bread was worth more, in the eyes of the law, than the life of a girl who stole it to keep her brother breathing. She turned into an alley she knew, narrow, choked with barrels, the kind of place a person could vanish if they were small enough and desperate enough. She was both. What she did not know, what she could not have known, crouched behind a stack of empty crates with the bread clutched to her chest like a heartbeat, was that a carriage bearing the crest of House Ravensworth had stopped at the corner of that very street only moments before, and that its occupant, drawn by the commotion, had lowered the window to watch. Duke Cassian Ravensworth was not a man given to curiosity about the affairs of common thieves. At 26, he had inherited a dukedom heavy with debt, and heavier still, with the weight of a war that had taken his father, and left the family name tarnished in the eyes of the crown. He had spent the last 3 years rebuilding what could be rebuilt and burying, as best he could, what could not. He had little patience left over for the small tragedies of Ashcombe's poor. And yet, there was something in the way the girl ran, not with the practiced ease of a hardened criminal, but with the raw, unguarded terror of someone who had never done this before, and had done it anyway, that made him tell his driver to wait. He watched her duck into the alley. He watched the baker's wife give up the chase at the corner, red-faced and cursing, more interested in returning to her stall than in truly catching the girl. He watched, through the gap in the curtain, as the alley fell still. And then, because he was a man who had learned, painfully, at great cost, that mercy withheld was sometimes a debt that came due later in ways far worse than bread, he stepped out of the carriage. Elira did not hear him approach until his shadow fell across the crates. She scrambled backward, bread still clutched against her ribs, and looked up to find not a constable, not the baker's furious husband, but a tall man in a gray wool coat, his dark hair unfashionably long, his eyes, she would remember this detail for the rest of her life, the pale, storm-colored gray of a sky before snow. "You're not going to scream," he said. It was not a question. "Are you going to turn me in?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He studied her for a long moment. The threadbare shawl, the bruised knuckles, the fierce, frightened defiance in her face, and something shifted behind his eyes that she could not name. "That depends," the Duke said quietly, "on why a girl who is clearly starving stole only 1 loaf, when she could have taken 3. Elira's jaw tightened. "Because I only have 2 hands, and I was not about to be greedy with someone else's flour." A ghost of something, not quite a smile, touched the corner of his mouth. "Most people, in your position, would have taken all they could carry." "Most people," she said, "have not watched their little brother go 3 days without eating." The words left her before she could stop them, and she hated herself for it. Hated that she had handed this stranger, this obvious lord with his fine coat and his crested carriage, a piece of her family's shame like a gift. But the Duke did not laugh. He did not sneer, as she had expected any nobleman to do. Instead, he crouched down to her level, so that his gray eyes were level with her own, and asked her a question she had not expected. "What is your brother's name? Why does that matter to you?" "Because," he said, rising and extending a hand that she did not take, "I find that I would like to know whose life I have just decided to involve myself in." Elira stared at his outstretched hand, as if it might bite her. Nobles did not help thieves. Nobles did not crouch in alleyways to ask after starving children. Whatever this man wanted, it was not kindness. Kindness did not exist for girls like her. Not in Ashcombe. Not anywhere she had ever lived. And yet the bread was still warm beneath her shawl, and the Duke was still waiting. And somewhere across the city her brother was still cold. "His name is Thomas," she said finally. The Duke nodded once, as though she had passed some manner of test. "Then let us see about getting Thomas somewhere warmer than wherever he is now." Elira did not move. "And what do you want in return?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, as though it had not occurred to him, in his long climb toward this alley, that a starving girl might have learned, better than most, that nothing in this world came free. "Nothing," he said. "Not yet." It was the not yet that stayed with her, long after she had finally, reluctantly, taken his hand. The Ravensworth townhouse rose out of the Ashcombe fog like something out of a story Elira had never been told. Gray stone softened by ivy, tall windows glowing amber against the gathering dusk, a warmth radiating from its very walls that had nothing to do with the fires burning inside. She had not wanted to come. She had argued, in fact, the entire way there, her small hand locked around Thomas's the moment they had collected him from the crumbling tenement room they called home, arguing that she did not trust Charity, that Charity always had teeth hidden somewhere beneath its softness, that she had learned this lesson from her mother, before her mother had died, coughing into a rag 2 winters past. The Duke had listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she had finished, he had simply said, "You may leave whenever you like. The door will not be locked." Somehow that had unsettled her more than if he had argued back. Now, seated in a library larger than the entire building she had grown up in, with Thomas asleep against her side and a bowl of stew going cold in her hands, because she could not stop staring at the shelves of books, more books than she had known existed in the world, Elira found herself studying the Duke as carefully as he had studied her in that alley. He did not eat with them. He sat across the room at his desk, a stack of ledgers before him, his quill moving in short, frustrated strokes, and every few minutes his gray eyes would flick up to check that they were still there, as though some part of him did not quite believe it either. "You keep looking at us," Elira said, "like you expect us to disappear." "I keep looking," the Duke said without glancing up this time, "because I am trying to determine why I brought a thief and her brother into my home instead of simply giving you coin and sending you on your way, which would have been the sensible thing to do." "And why didn't you?" Now he did look up. "I have not yet worked that out myself." It was the ledgers, Elira would learn over the following days, that told the truer story, not of her, but of him. The Ravensworth estate was drowning, quietly and methodically, in debts left behind by a father who had gambled away half the family's holdings before dying in a war that had gained the crown nothing but grief. The Duke rose before dawn and worked past midnight, not from ambition, but from something closer to desperation dressed in duty's clothing. He was, she came to realize, not so very different from her, both of them holding up a world that threatened at any moment to collapse on the people they loved. The staff whispered about her, of course. She heard them in the corridors. A street thief, in the Duke's own house, has he lost his senses? and she did not blame them for the suspicion in their eyes. She would have thought the same in their position. Only one person among the household did not look at her that way. A kitchen maid named Bess, barely older than Elira herself, who slipped her an extra roll at breakfast and taught her, without being asked, the proper way to hold a teacup so the other servants would stop staring. "He's not what people say, you know," Bess told her one afternoon, kneading dough with quick, practiced hands. The old Duke, his father, now he was a cruel man. This one's just tired. Tired men look harsh even when they don't mean to. Why does everyone excuse him so easily? Bess glanced up, something careful in her expression. Because 3 years ago, when his father died and left this house in ruins, the new Duke could have turned every one of us out to save himself the wages. Instead, he sold his own horses first. It was a small fact, but it lodged itself in Elira's chest like a splinter she could not quite work free. Tomas, for his part, adjusted to the townhouse with the easy resilience of a child who had spent his short life expecting very little and had suddenly been given more than he knew what to do with. He followed the Duke through the halls with wide-eyed devotion, asking endless questions about the suits of armor in the East Corridor, about the horses in the stable, about whether dukes were required to fight dragons as part of their duties. The Duke answered every question with a patience that surprised Elira more each time she witnessed it, crouching down to Thomas's height, the same way he had crouched to hers in the alley, as if some part of him understood instinctively what it meant to be small in a world built for the large. It was on the 7th evening, when she found Tomas curled asleep in the Duke's own study chair, with the Duke's coat draped over him, and the Duke himself standing very still nearby, clearly unwilling to disturb the boy, that Elira allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to trust. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said quietly, from the doorway. "No," the Duke agreed. "I didn't." "Then why?" He was silent long enough that she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual careful distance. "Because my father spent his life taking from people who could not afford to lose anything, and I have spent 3 years trying to atone for a debt I did not create. Perhaps I saw, in that alley, a chance to be the kind of man he never was." It should have been enough of an answer, but something in the careful way he said it, the slight hesitation before chance, the way his eyes did not quite meet hers, told Elira there was more beneath it, a truth he was not yet ready to hand her. She did not press. Not that night. But 3 days later, sorting through a box of old correspondence Bess had asked her to help carry to the study, Elira's hand closed around a letter bearing a seal she recognized from the market gossip that swirled endlessly through Ashcombe streets, the seal of a magistrate's office, and beneath it, her own family name, misspelled but unmistakable, dated some 4 years past. Her mother's name, Adette. A signature that was not her mother's, forged in a hand she did not recognize, but stamped at the bottom with the very crest that hung above the Duke's own fireplace. Elira read the letter 3 times before the words stopped swimming. It was a record of debt, a loan taken against her family's small leased plot of land 4 years ago, the same year her father had vanished from Ashcombe without explanation, the same year her mother's cough had first begun, worsening steadily under a grief and a burden Elira had never fully understood as a child. The debt bore her mother's name at the bottom, but the hand that had written it, the careful, looping script of the signature, it was not her mother's. Her mother had never learned to write her own name in that fashion. She had signed everything with a simple, blocky mark, taught to her by the parish priest. This signature curled and flourished in a way that spoke of education, of a hand well practiced with a quill, and stamped above it, unmistakable, was the Ravensworth seal. Elira sat very still in the study, the letter trembling faintly in her grip, and felt the warm trust of the last 7 days curdle into something cold and sharp in her stomach. She did not confront him immediately. She told herself this was caution, but in truth it was fear. Fear that if she asked and received the answer she suspected, she would lose the one safe place she and Thomas had found in years, and lose it by her own hand. Instead, she went to Bess. "The old Duke," Alira said carefully, turning a teacup in her hands without drinking from it. "The cruel one. Did he ever deal in debts? Loans to families in the city?" Bess's expression shifted, quick and involuntary, before she smoothed it into practiced neutrality. "Where did you hear something like that?" "Bess." The maid set down her rolling pin with a heavy sigh, glancing toward the kitchen door as though the walls themselves might carry word back to the family upstairs. The old Duke ran half his fortune through loans to families too desperate to read the fine print. Land loans, mostly. Poor families would borrow against their leased plots to cover a bad harvest or a sickness, and when they couldn't repay in time, she hesitated. The land would transfer to Ravensworth Holdings. Legal as anything, since the families had signed. Except what? Except there were whispers back then that not every signature on those papers was genuine. That the old Duke's steward had a talent for forging a mark when a family was too frightened or too desperate to notice what they were truly agreeing to. Nothing was ever proven. The old Duke died before anyone dared look closely, and the current Duke... Bess's voice softened. The current Duke spent his first year going through every one of those old contracts, tearing up half of them himself when he found proof of the forgeries. He returned land to families all across the county. I thought he'd found them all. Alira's throat tightened. What if he hadn't? That evening, she brought the letter to him herself. She found him in the study, ledgers spread before him as always, and she set the paper down on his desk without a word. She watched the color leave his face as he read it. Watched his jaw tighten, watched something break open behind his gray eyes that looked less like guilt and more like grief. "This is my father's steward's hand," he said quietly. "I would know it anywhere. I spent a year burning documents just like this one." He looked up at her, and for the first time since the alley, she saw something in him that looked almost like fear. "Alira, this is your mother's name." "Yes." "Your family lost their land 4 years ago. To a forged debt." "Yes," she said again, and her voice cracked on the word despite every effort to keep it steady. "My father left that same year. My mother always said the debt broke something in him, that he couldn't bear what it did to us, couldn't bear looking at her knowing he'd signed something he didn't understand. He left to find work in the capital, to try to earn enough to buy the land back. He never came home. My mother died still waiting for a letter from him that never came, still believing she owed a debt that was never truly hers." The Duke was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rough. "I did not know. I swear to you, on my father's grave and gladly, I did not know this document existed. I thought I had found every fraud he committed. I thought I had made what amends I could. But you didn't find this one." "No." He rose from his desk, crossed the room, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked at her. Not as a benefactor looks at the object of his charity, but as an equal looks at someone he has deeply wronged. "I brought you into my home believing I was offering you mercy. I did not know I was harboring the daughter of a family my own house destroyed." The revelation hung between them, heavier than anything Alira had imagined when she first slipped that loaf of bread beneath her shawl. She had come to this house believing herself a thief taken in by an unlikely kindness. She now understood herself to be something else entirely, a debt come home to collect itself, whether either of them had intended it or not. "What happens now?" she asked. The Duke's answer came without hesitation, though his voice shook with the weight of it. "Now I do what should have been done 4 years ago. I return what was stolen from your family, the land, and more besides, whatever it takes to answer for what my house did to yours." And then he stopped himself. some careful wall coming down over his expression. And then what? And then I suppose we discover whether a debt this size can ever truly be repaid, or whether some wrongs simply have to be lived with on both sides, for as long as two people are willing to try. The magistrate's office in Ashcombe had not seen a crowd like this in years. Word had spread, as word always did in a city built on gossip and hunger, that the Duke of Ravensworth himself was appearing before the county registrar to overturn a 4-year-old land claim, and that the girl standing beside him, dressed in a borrowed but respectable blue wool coat, was the very same thief who had stolen a loaf of bread from the market not 3 weeks prior. Elira felt every eye in the room as the Duke laid the forged letter on the registrar's desk, alongside a second document, one he had drafted himself, over 2 sleepless nights, restoring the least plot to her family's name and adding beyond what she had asked or expected, a modest sum in restitution for 4 years of wrongful loss. "This is more than the land was worth," she whispered to him, as the registrar reviewed the papers. "It is considerably less than what your family lost," the Duke said quietly. "A mother, a father who never came home. Years you and your brother spent hungry in a house that should have been yours. I cannot return any of that to you. This is the smallest part of an apology I owe." The registrar's seal came down on the papers with a heavy, final thud, and just like that, the land that had broken her family was hers again. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, standing in the crowded office with Thomas's small hand gripping hers and the Duke close at her shoulder, Elira felt something far more complicated. Grief for a mother who had not lived to see this moment, anger at a father who had vanished rather than face what had been done to them, and beneath it all, a fragile, unfamiliar gratitude toward the very house whose crest had caused her family's ruin. Outside, the crowd had not yet dispersed. The baker's wife stood near the steps, watching with an expression Elira could not quite read, somewhere between shame and reluctant respect, before she stepped forward. "The bread," the woman said, wringing her apron in her hands. "I never should have raised such a fuss over 1 loaf. Had I known—" "You didn't know," Elira said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it without bitterness. "None of us knew anything back then." That evening, in the same study where the truth had first broken open between them, the Duke stood at the window overlooking the darkening city, and Elira came to stand beside him, no longer a stranger in his home, but not yet certain what she was instead. "Your family has their land back," he said. "Tomas will want for nothing, so long as I have breath to arrange it. You are free to go whenever you wish. The door was never locked, and it never will be. And if I don't wish to go?" He turned to look at her then, and for the first time since the alley, she saw the careful distance in his gray eyes fall away entirely, replaced by something raw and uncertain and hopeful in equal measure. "Then I would count myself the most fortunate debtor who ever lived," he said quietly, "to be allowed to keep paying a debt for the rest of his days, in whatever form you'll permit." Elira thought of the girl who had run through the frozen streets of Ashcombe with a warm loaf clutched to her chest, terrified and starving, and certain that no kindness in the world came without a hidden cost. That girl could not have imagined this moment, could not have imagined that the very hand she feared would turn her in would instead become the hand that returned everything her family had lost, and asked for nothing but the chance to keep trying. "Thomas likes it here," she said finally, a small, unguarded smile breaking through. "He'd never forgive me if I made him leave the library. And you?" "I think," Elira said, watching the last light fade over a city that had nearly broken her and had, instead, given her back everything she never thought to hope for, "that I would like to see what a debt repaid slowly, over many years, might come to look like." The Duke's answering smile was the first she had ever seen from him that reached all the way to his eyes.